a center of religious life, of education, and of commerce, a center of community life and the administration of government, and also a home for the gods themselves. Let's examine the ancient Egyptian temple with our first example, the Temple of Horus at Edfu. Hey folks, this is James, aka Threskiornis. Welcome back to the Scroll of Thoth. While I was making my videos on ancient Egyptian magical practice, I was reminded once again just how important the priesthood was to the practice of magic in Egypt. They were the font of magic, maybe not all magic, but certainly what was written down and what has been passed down to us. And so I thought it might be fruitful to take a look where the priesthood operated. What were the temples like? Because they were quite different than what we think of churches today. Of course, at the end, I'm going to tie it all into how this might be helpful to a modern-day magical practitioner. I'm sure a lot of you are going to be happy to see me return to the subject of ancient Egypt, and I'm going to tell you this video is the start of another series that I'll be making about temples in ancient Egypt, and I'll be picking specific temples and doing highlights of them and their different aspects. This will probably go on for quite some time. Why the Temple of Edfu? Well, those of you who know me probably know I'm not a huge fan of New Kingdom. I'm not a huge fan of the Ptolemaic area. I'm not really a huge fan of Horus either, to tell you the truth. I respect him. You have to. But he's not my go-to guy. What the Temple of Edfu is, though, is one of the best preserved examples of an ancient Egyptian temple. There's a lot there that has been kept up. There's a lot there that hasn't been torn down. So I think it's a great place to start. And looking at the specific aspects of the Temple of Horus at Edfu is going to get us a good feel for at least this type of ancient Egyptian temple. Now, as we go on in this series, I'm going to start picking temples that we plan on visiting later on this year. That way, we could get a good comparison of what is known about the temple, what other people have said about it, and what we actually see on the ground. And I think you're really going to enjoy that. In general, ancient Egyptian temples can be split into two main types. The first ones being the temples that are religious centers to a specific god, or sometimes a group of gods, sometimes referred to as a god's mansion or god's home. This is what we generally think of, as a temple, a place to come and worship a divine being. But never forget that the pharaohs themselves were also looked at as divine beings. And so the second type of temple that's out there is the mortuary temple, the temple where people would come and honor and give sacrifices to the pharaohs of the past. And some of those temples went on for generations and generations, where the names of the pharaohs, the spirits of the pharaohs were kept alive. And it was believed that this is how eternity was achieved, to always be remembered, to always be receiving some kind of offering. But Edfu is a god's home. It is the home of Horus in the New Kingdom, in the Ptolemaic era, when Horus is firmly established as the god of kingship. But understand, once again, these are not modern churches, and different temples had different functions, or at least different areas of specialty. And some were schools, some were centers of administration, some were alternate homes for the pharaohs. You know, going to a temple was not always about going to worship the god there. There was a whole bunch of other stuff going on in the ancient Egyptian temples. Scribes could be seen sitting around doing their work. Taxes would be collected. All of those sort of things. They would act as a center of government as well as religious life, because the two were inseparable. The two were always the same. And while the pharaohs did have their own mortuary temples, they were also well represented in these gods' homes. And you'll see the pharaoh represented in the temple of Horus and Edfu. Now, as much as I would love to get into all the different spiritual aspects of the temple and all the different ways that the Egyptians viewed their temples as a spiritual place, since Edfu is so well preserved, I think it's best that we kind of stick to the different architectural aspects of the temple and kind of run through that with this video and maybe get into some of those other aspects in the future. The temple is located between Luxor and Aswan, firmly in what is considered Upper Egypt. For those of you who need a refresher, Lower Egypt was the area along the coast of the Mediterranean, the Nile Delta area, maybe a little bit further south than that. And Upper Egypt was the rest of the country along the Nile until you start reaching the first cataracts of the Nile, which were the rapids that made the river unnavigable at that point. Of course, if you're going anywhere important in Egypt, you were sailing on the Nile. And so temples were built close to the Nile. Temples had their own landing areas. And from those landing areas, you would be on a path specifically to the temple. And many temples had statues and flags set up along the route, getting larger and grander as you approached. The temple at Luxor had 1,350 sphinxes that you would pass by before reaching the temple. Here we can see a surviving sphinx here on the path to Edfu. How many statues there were, what else was there, it's impossible for us to know. But there's a good chance it was paved and there was a lot to see along the way. Outside the temple proper, Edfu also had something that a lot of the New Kingdom temples had, something called a birth house. This term, which is actually a Coptic word for birthplace, was originally invented for the structure by Jean-Francois Champollion of Rosetta Stone fame. Located within the temple precinct and often oriented at right angles to the main axis of the temple, this type of structure was associated with the mysterious birth of the gods and the celebration of their births. Particularly in New Kingdom mimesis, the divine birth of the king might also be celebrated. While the birth of a god such as Horus the Younger was primary in the mimesis, the king's divine relationship with the gods is also frequently stressed. Mimesis were very common in the Greek and Roman period, when they were present in all known major temples, but their origin was probably Egypt's late period. However, there appears evidence by the 18th dynasty reliefs describing the divine birth of Hatshepsut at Deir el-Bahari and that of Amenhotep III at Luxor to have been earlier counterparts. At Edfu, The birth of the god and of the pharaoh was celebrated once per year in what was called the Coronation Festival. This leads us up to the Pylon, or the gate, another famous aspect of the temple at Edfu for how well it has been preserved. The three most striking engravings on the pylons are an engraving of Horus, an engraving of Hathor. For in Edfu, Hathor was celebrated as the wife of Horus, and an engraving of the pharaoh smashing the enemies of Egypt. The pylon during the time of the temple's use would have been painted bright colors, especially the figures in the engravings. Note that the pylons are also fortifications, an excellent place to hole up in times of invasion or perhaps an uprising by the local population. After passing through the gates of the pylons, one would enter the main courtyard of the temple, probably the only place that most commoners would see, because passing further required ritual purification and was generally reserved for the priests and for royalty. In the Ptolemaic period, when Edfu was built, it would be called the Court of the Multitudes. The courtyard would be open air and surrounded by columns, and this would be the place where the people would gather for parades and festivals. Also in the outer courtyard, you would find more statues donated by kings and priests, but also statues donated by commoners. These statues of commoners were often put in positions of reverence or worship so that they can give praise to the gods for all eternity. And here again we see the concept of intercession, because if you had someone in your family who had enough money, who had enough status to put a statue in the temple, well, of course, you would go to them and ask them to intercede on your behalf with the gods. And so they would become honored ancestors. But this wasn't only reserved for family. In fact, one of these commoner statues had an inscription that said, "If you say my name in offering, I will praise the gods in your name and ask them to do what you want." So this was another way for someone who is even a commoner to reach immortality, to always have some kind of offering, even if it was just someone saying their name, and keep their memory alive. This is not from Edfu, but here we see an example of what's called a block statue, which is typical of these commoner statues, as they didn't require as much skill to create. This statue depicts a scribe who comes bearing a statue of Thoth as a baboon. So if you were royalty or a high enough ranking priest, you could be allowed to enter the next section of the temple, which was called the Hypostyle Hall. Now, every temple had a book of the temple, which outlined the specifications of what someone must do before they entered the temple proper. That they had to have clean clothes, that they had to be freshly bathed, that they had to be anointed with oils, that they had to say these specific rituals. And the books would detail this, and anyone who came to enter further into the temple would be scrutinized by the priest before they were allowed to pass. Now, this type of hall was packed with towering rows of columns, which were highly ornate, and also this is where the temple starts to have a ceiling. The further one moved to the back of the hall, the darker it became, and the maze of columns assured no prying eyes would see any further into the temple. Imagine entering from the blazing sun of the courtyard into the coolness of the Hypostyle hall. You would be inspected, washed, and oils and perfumes applied. You would speak the purification rituals as you moved further into darkness, the smell of incense wafting out from the inner chambers. The hall would be busy with priests bringing offerings to and from the god. At Edfu, you would enter a second, smaller Hypostyle hall. Again, you would be inspected and purified with even more scrutiny, more purification rituals as you move deeper into the temple, dwarfed by the massive columns, their tops now lost to shadow, as you rely on torchlight to make your way. So only then would you be allowed to enter the offering hall, which would be dominated by a huge altar, and there would be engravings all around of the king giving offerings to the god and receiving gifts in return. Now, the temple book would also have instructions, how much incense was to be burnt and when, what offerings of oils, what types of oils, what kind of oils would be used to anoint the statue of the god, and what kind of food and drink would be brought to the god and how often. And this is how Egypt maintained such a large priesthood, because the protocol demanded that the person who brought an offering of food and drink to the god would be required to consume that themselves, whether it be a priest or a royal. So this is how the priesthood was fed. This is how craftsmen sometimes were fed. If you were a high enough rank to make that offering to the god, then you were able to consume that food or that beverage. And beyond the offering hall lies the inner sanctum. Engraved on the walls of the temple at Edfu is a complete depiction in pictures and hieroglyphs of one of the most enduring Egyptian myths, the contendings of Horus and Seth. Surrounding the chamber of the god at Edfu were various chapels that would ensure the inclusion of other important gods or even represent certain meaningful symbols such as the tomb of Osiris and the throne of Ra. So the next time you see a sensationalist article out there, and I've seen a few of these from time to time, that archaeologists have unearthed the tomb of Osiris, this is what they're talking about. They haven't unearthed a god's tomb or some pharaoh claiming to be Osiris. These were chapels that were representations of the tomb of Osiris that were included because of how important they were as a part of ancient Egyptian mythology. And of course, in the Temple of Horus, Osiris as his father would be included there. At the center, the Holy of Holies, the chamber of the god. And like other temples at Edfu, this included a bark, a type of boat common in ancient Egypt. This bark would be used to carry the god on parade during festivals. And note that I keep saying the god and not the statue, because to the ancient Egyptians, the statue was the god. It had at least a piece of the god in it. In fact, every statue representation did. Even statues of kings had a piece of that king. They were to be treated as the god itself. Now, amazingly, the wooden bark that would be used to carry the statue of Horus forth survives. Unfortunately, because white people suck, the one that is currently in the Temple of Edfu is a reproduction, because the original is in the Louvre, of course, because, the Egyptians can't take care of their own things, of course. At the back a granite box called a naos that held the golden statue of Horus, a statue plated in gold, carried forth from the temple into the sunlight on its festival days, and this would be an amazing sight to see as a group of priests hauling that bark up on their shoulders, coming forth out of the temple, the sunlight gleaming off the gold of the statue. I mean, how could you not believe that it was the God himself coming forth? So what can we learn from these temples and what went on there? And how is that going to inform a modern magician? Well, one thing that I noticed right away was the Book of the Temple. And the Book of the Temple is protocol. These are all the protocols of the temple. And it's a huge scroll. All these different things. You can't be in mourning when you enter. You can't eat certain foods before you enter. And what I've noticed from my own interaction with the spirits is that as time goes on, and as you talk to the same spirits more and more, they keep revealing more and more their protocol. They keep asking for more things. They keep saying, well, this is how I want you to approach me. These are the offerings that I want you to make. These are the times of day that I want you to do it. These are the other offerings that you're supposed to make. These are the words that you're supposed to say, and on and on. And it's all protocol. Protocol, the essence of diplomacy. And said it before, Gordon White said it first, magic is, if anything, extra-dimensional diplomacy. Though I think the thing that you really need to keep in mind is that you're a magician, you're not a priest, right? So you don't have to give in to every demand. You don't have to live your life around what they want, because they'll do that. They will try to wrap you around their finger and get you to do every single little thing and just be living your life for them. Don't do that. You're a magician. You're here to get something in return. Another thing the temples illustrate, again, is how useful it is to have a physical representation of the spirit that you're trying to communicate with. And I know not everyone can afford to have statues or has a place to keep them, but maybe you can make a drawing and hang it up on the wall and use that as a focus for your interactions. I've found that I will even find statues of spirits that are unknown, like my friend Abtet, who, without even trying, someone gave me this statue for Christmas, who didn't even know who Abtet was, but seems to be a perfect representation for him. Another thing I have is I have a small little chibi statue of Thoth that stands right above my kitchen counter, so that he knows that all the food that I'm preparing here is also an offering to him. So if you do have a statue, treat it like it's the god itself. You want to wash your statues. You want to treat them with respect and dignity. Perhaps even anoint your statues with sacred oils. Speaking of which, I really hope you hang around till after the break here, because I'm going to have some announcements that I think you're going to find really interesting. Add your name to the Scroll of Thoth by joining our Ko-Fi fundraising campaign. Ko-Fi subscribers will receive access to the extensive archive of Scroll of Thoth podcasts, access to our private Discord server, special extended cuts of our videos, a 10% discount in our store on all Scarlet Ibis Apothecary items, bonus videos and other content, and a free 3-card tarot reading every month for those who subscribe for $10 or more. Help me create more videos on the occult and the spiritual history of ancient Egypt. Discover a magic that goes beyond the repeated platitudes of Victorian-era dilettantes and look into the true heart of the Western esoteric tradition. Many of you know the history of the most famous sacred oil in all of magic, the oil of Abramelin. It was a formula taught to Moses, and most likely that it's based off ancient Egyptian anointing oil called the oil of Tanakh. Now, in modern days, the ingredients for this oil are usually translated as cinnamon, myrrh, and galangal, or maybe calmus. In fact, there's a lot of debate on that last ingredient. And there are some folks who believe that it really makes more sense that the translation for that last ingredient, what we're talking about, is cannabis. So, as a part of Scarlet Ibis Apothecary, I have created a batch of oil of Abramelin with olive oil, cinnamon, myrrh, and cannabis, specifically hemp CBD flower. And we're going to be offering those for sale in the Ko-Fi store on 4/20. Now, it's only going to be for sale to folks who are subscribers to our Ko-Fi. And I did that for a few reasons. Number one, because it's still questionably legal of where I can ship these products. Even though it's just CBD, laws differ, and I wanted to make sure that I'm only selling it to people who are really fans and people who aren't going to show it to the wrong people. Another reason is, I want you to sign up for my Ko-Fi. Now get this, Ko-Fi subscribers get 10% off any product in the Scarlet Ibis Apothecary store. And this oil will be selling for $35, so you're going to save more money on the oil by being a subscriber because it's only $3 to sign up. Of course, yes, there is $10 shipping on everything in our store, but that's a $10 flat rate shipping, and you can order as much as you want for that one shipping price. And of course, the last reason why I did it is I hope that you'll stick around, take a look at the content that we have there, like our video on drugs in ancient Egypt, and you might decide to continue being a subscriber. Another thing I want to remind folks of, that it's festival season, and man, I am just really looking forward to it this year. After going through chemotherapy, I just feel like getting out there to festival is just going to be really important to me this year. So just to let you know where we're going to be at, I'll be at Toadfest June 2nd to the 4th, and that's at Our Haven Nature Sanctuary in French Lick, Indiana. And I'll be returning to the Starwood Festival on July 11th through the 14th. You should really watch my video on Wisteria to learn why I've fallen in love with that festival and its campground. Hey folks, thank you so much for watching to the end. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button, and I hope to see you in person soon. Until next time.